It's Wednesday, August 27, 2014, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, covering Ferguson for the long term, Huffington Post hires a fellow to monitor the situation there. We'll talk about the unconventional system it's using to pay her. Doing less with less at CNN. It's a sad, albeit refreshing, leadership response to hundreds of staff buyouts. And an Arkansas reporter packs up and leaves her job, and police chief in that town is out of a job after a war of web comments between the two. There's a lot more that we'll hopefully get to as well, but let's start with a cartoon published in the Columbia Daily Tribune that's being called racist. Gary McCoy drew the syndicated political cartoon. It shows 4 people protesting and looting. There's one black man wearing a shirt with an Obama for America logo, carrying a picket sign with letters written backward that read "Burn Ferguson." Another black man pickets with his pants riding low on his hips. A third black man, presumably a looter, is carrying a television. And then there's a fourth man, a white man wearing a backwards ball cap, and he's holding a sign that reads, "No 60-inch plasma TV, no peace." Behind them, Ferguson burns. Managing editor Jim Robertson told media blogger Jim Romanesco he didn't expect the negative response he's had to that. He said he thought the cartoon was provocative, but not racist in its intent. Let me ask you, what was your first reaction when you saw this?
Well, my first reaction when I saw the newspaper that day, and usually open it up at some point and look at the editorial page, I saw the cartoon and I went, oh, okay, that's pretty out there. And then my second thought was, this is going to get a lot of comments, which we've seen. And I think to a certain extent it is provocative, but it could also be seen as racist. I mean, the images play off of stereotypes. And cartoonists in situations like this do this all the time. So it's not anything unusual. But in a situation like Ferguson, in an atmosphere that's as volatile as this, I think editorial page editors need to be careful and also aware of how that is going to play out among their audience.
I don't know if I'm going to say whether it's racist or not. It definitely could be read by people as saying that all protesters are black or all protesters are looters, and neither of those things is true, of course. I will say this, though, except for Jim Robertson saying he was surprised at the level of comment. I don't think he should have been surprised, but I also think we ought to put this in context. If we're going to criticize the Tribune, as a lot of people just reflexively did. I mean, editorial cartoons, as Ernest said, they're deliberately provocative. They deliberately use exaggeration to try to make a larger political point, and this happened here. But if you look at the context of the Tribune, I mean, this is also the only local media organization I know of that did early on a very substantive story looking back at the Kim Lindsay shooting 30 years ago here in Columbia and asking the questions of whether or not we've learned anything about community policing and race relations as a result of that. They've also run multiple editorial cartoons and columns, that were much more sympathetic and raising issues about race as it relates to, the Michael Brown shooting. So I'm not sure I would single out that one thing and call the Tribune racist.
So let's add even more context to this. The editorial cartoon spread online without the benefit, in most cases, of the PDF, which showed how it appeared in print on the printed page, where it was placed next to a column about the idea of looting not being a legitimate form of protest. How does seeing this image next to a column making that point perhaps change how the message could be interpreted?
Well, I think when you look at the page in its entirety, which I did, and I actually read that column, which is a pretty good column, it provides the context that you need to understand the editorial stance, I guess you would say, of the Columbia Daily Tribune. If you aren't getting that, if you're only reading the subsequent chatter after it's printed and you don't see it in its entirety, then you're going to get a skewed view of the entire issue. Either you're going to, depending on what you're reading, you're going to be for it or you're going to be against it. So I think that if you really, if the audience really wants to know what is happening here, they need to be able to look at the entire thing.
Yeah, and I think the unfortunate thing is I too read the Rich Lowry column, and he comes at it from a conservative perspective, but it's a very thoughtful perspective. You can agree or disagree. And if you look at the two in context, you might have a different reaction. But it says something also about the power that images have always had and the increasing power that images have now in the internet age. And I just think a lot of people will never get the context, and so they're only responding to the cartoon.
Right. It sort of goes back to an article I read yesterday in the New York Times in its Upshot column, where they talk about the fact that social media now, which was supposed to be, or the internet, which was supposed to be a way for everyone to be able to engage, has now turned into a medium that people use to pretty much stay in their own box. And that's really part of the problem here, is that there's that a lot of people are gravitating toward information that fits into their own little
personal narrative, or the narrative that they want to see or accept.
Exactly.
Okay, so sort of on that subject, let me put this out there. Michael Brown was no angel. The New York Times said so right there in the 5th paragraph of a front-page profile in Sunday's paper. And boy, did it catch heat for using what public editor Margaret Sullivan called an ill-chosen phrase in her follow-up column on Monday. The reporter said that he was trying to convey that the teen wasn't perfect, that he'd had scuffles with neighbors, experimented with drugs and alcohol, and sometimes wrote vulgar rap lyrics. It sounds a little bit like a teenager being a teenager and then calling him no angel.
You know, I can see why people would be upset. I can also see why a lot of provocateurs in the press and elsewhere want to just use this reflexively as another chance to bash. And frankly, I'm kind of surprised at how quickly Margaret Sullivan, the public editor for the New York Times, basically apologized for everybody when I'm not sure they should have. I mean, if you read that story, again, here, gee, what a concept. Let's read the story before you criticize it. It starts off with a very positive story about Michael Brown seeing in the clouds a picture of an angel and finally coming to decide that maybe he did believe in God after all, and conveying that to his parents. That was the setup for the line, whether you think the phrase, no angel is good or bad. It was playing directly off that very positive anecdote in the story. And the other thing I'd say about it is, if you read the story in its entirety, the only people who are quoted in that story are his mother, his father, an uncle, a cousin, and one of his best friends. They are telling his story the way they want it told the day before his funeral. How can anybody say, as a lot of critics tried to say, that the Times, either deliberately or not, was basically saying he deserved to be shot? That is not what the Times story was trying to do or should be interpreted as doing.
I think this is one of those instances where you have people who have an axe to grind against the New York Times see an opening and they go after it without even
however small, 7 characters.
Exactly. Without even looking at the entire, as Mike said, the entire story in the context in which it was presented. This was his family telling his story, and quite often this is the kind of journalism that people say they want. But you also have to take into account that you're going to have people out there who are, especially in involving this story, who are going to use it for their advantage. And the other thing I want to say is I actually read a story from the actual reporter who wrote that story, who said, he basically said, I probably should have used another phrase. I should have basically said that he was not perfect instead of saying he was no angel. So it sort of goes back to something I tell my students all the time, which is words have meaning. And you need to be as specific and direct as possible in what you're trying to convey. And sometimes using a cliche or using a phrase where you may actually think it fits, may also present something that you totally didn't think about.
I do agree with that, but there were levels of editing of this story before it appeared in the paper. And it wasn't like, some clueless elite white reporter doing a stupid thing. John Elegant is a black reporter. He's been working in the Missouri area for a long time. There are editors there. And it just seems to me that what Margaret Sullivan, the public editor, did, and what, you quoted John as basically saying, maybe I should have used a different phrase. That was kind of the lightest weight sort of apology. We're all expected to apologize now and then move on to the next thing. Maybe I'm being a little bit cynical, but I don't think the Times really is sorry that they wrote the story the way they did it. And Dean Baquet, the new executive editor of the Times, hasn't even been heard from commenting on it yet. So I don't think the paper truly thinks that they made a mistake.
Okay. Well, there's a neat partnership in the works that, if successful, could set a trend for global news coverage. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch and The Guardian are teaming up to gather stories of racial profiling and then publishing each other's work. How exactly do the editors on either side of the pond see this coming together?
This is going to be interesting because who's going to make the decision as to what's racial profiling and what's not racial profiling, and which story gets on and which story doesn't? Because as someone pointed out, I'm trying to remember who it was, but I was reading this morning, racial profiling occurs on an hourly basis in this country. And how are you going to get those stories? Are you someone just going to be able to submit it? And then is there going to be any fact checking? Who's going to do that? I mean, it seems a little weird to me.
Yeah.
Well, and The Guardian does crowdsourcing and some of these online initiatives better than almost anybody out there. Post-Dispatch really has an opportunity to capitalize on their experience and their expertise to bring some of that back here.
But are they going to be able, do they actually have the manpower to do that? And from my understanding, they were having a hard enough time just covering what was going on in Ferguson, let alone everything else that was happening in the St. Louis region. So are they going to basically just take what The Guardian has and run it verbatim, or are they going to have the capability to check that out themselves?
Well, let's commit the three of us to keep watching and seeing over time and see if this thing works. The Huffington Post says it's committed to staying in Ferguson. It's named Lindenwood University graduate Mariah Stewart the recipient of the newly created Ferguson Fellowship. She'll spend a year working with HuffPost reporter Ryan Riley looking at how the police got its military-grade equipment and report on efforts to reform the police departments there. Here's the thing. The Huffington Post and Beacon Reader are using crowdfunding to pay for the $40,000 a year fellowship. Is this an innovative approach, or is this another way of saying if you want this reporting to happen, you're going to be the one to pay for it?
I'm going to be my typical cynical self in just a moment. But before I do that, I do want to say that the stated objectives for doing this, which is basically bringing somebody from the community in to report about this and give a different take on it. Very good. Saying that long after the mainstream media leave town, we're going to stay on this story.
Very good.
That's very good. I don't believe that that's all that this is about. Now, I mean, I will give Mariah the benefit of the doubt. I mean, she came upon this story as a young journalism graduate from Lindenwood University. She's working a job in a mall and retail, and she really is motivated to go back into the community when this story happens. And
this is her big break.
It's her big break. She's getting interviewed by the BBC. Beacon Reader is paying her a little bit of money to freelance this for a week. But the Huffington Post, I suggest to you, maybe had other motivations in mind. I mean, they see the popularity of crowdfunding. They had their own reporter who got kicked out of McDonald's by the police. And I just think that, and they're not putting any of their own money forward to pay her to do this.
And that's the problem I have, is that they're not putting forward their own money. If this is what you really want to do, then you need to invest in it, because it's not just an investment in her, it's an investment in the community and an investment in the region. And if you really care about covering the community and providing news and information to that audience, then you're going to invest in it. And I think this is something that's not just a problem with the Huffington Post, it's a problem with the media in general, is the unwillingness in certain parts of this country to invest what's necessary to be able to provide the news and information that that audience deserves.
I'm not saying that crowdfunding is always a bad idea when it comes to reporting, especially on undercovered topics or whatever. And they have raised, just in the past few days, about 40% or so of the money they need for the $40,000 to pay her for a year to do this. But I just have to, question, how's this going to work? Because I can guarantee you that Ryan Riley, the reporter who's been covering this, is not staying in St. Louis for a year. Maybe Mariah is staying in St. Louis for a year and covering this story. What is she going to bring to it that the other media aren't? Yes, she has her own community perspective and her life perspective. But do we really believe the other media, the mainstream media, are not going to be there when any kind of grand jury indictment, if anything, comes down? If there's a trial, they're not going to cover it. If there's a new report on the police department and how they, of course, the mainstream media are going to be there. So what kinds of stories is she going to tell for the Huffington Post that others aren't? I hope she will do something.
And what
interesting
happens
with
when
it.
that story plays out?
Yeah.
I mean, once you get past the grand jury investigation and the possible indictment and the civil cases and that sort of thing, are they making a long-term commitment to her and to the community to do that? I mean, $40,000 is just a drop in the bucket when you start thinking about. I mean, that's a low yearly salary. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about doing it for a couple of years, which I think is going to take a couple of years for this case to play through,
at the end of
now you're talking about several $100,000 commitment, and I don't think that's going to be the case.
And they really said they're going to spend $40,000 total, including benefits. So that's about a $31,000 a year salary for her to do this. Again, not a typically very good salary. And it's from AOL, the company that owns the Huffington Post. They've got a boatload of money they can throw at
Mike,
these things.
I was going to throw in there that you say crowdfunding for journalism isn't that much uncommon in these days, but it's a whole lot more palatable when the person who's doing the crowdfunding and asking for the money doesn't have the resources to do the reporting and the resources that AOL and the Huffington Post have.
And just one other thing. I mean, I will say, though, I am happy to bash the Huffington Post for what I think they're doing here and what they should be doing. How much different is this from major newspapers and broadcasters all around the United States having unpaid interns do this same kind of work for year after year after year?
And that's the point that I've made earlier, is that it's not just the Huffington Post. The Huffington Post is a part of a larger problem in media, which is investing in the reporting. Right. And they're not doing that at this particular point.
Well, a few weeks ago when we first started talking about what was going on in Ferguson, you heard Jim Flink mention that one of our students, Ryan Schisler, was there working as a freelance reporter for Al Jazeera's website. He wrote 4 stories and contributed to several others, which brought about some of the context we hadn't seen in other reports. He wrote about how the African-American community moved to Ferguson after being forced out of Kinloch for airport expansion that never materialized. He wrote about a hip-hop radio station that turned to an all-talk format to give people a voice during the protests. And he wrote about Ferguson residents working to clean up their neighborhood after looting. And once he decided he couldn't take it anymore, he wrote a personal blog post about why his time reporting from Ferguson was over, for now at least. In it, he described seeing news photographers taking bricks from retaining walls to weigh down broadcast tents, others yelling at residents to clear out from their camera shots, even others making it entirely about themselves. He recalled specifically a journalist who said he'd come to the scene because that journalist viewed it as a networking opportunity, then handed Ryan a camera asking if he would take a photo with CNN's Anderson Cooper. Ryan is a very familiar face to those of us here at RJI. He's been a student of mine for more than 3 years, and I knew he'd made this decision. He'd contacted me at several points during his time in Ferguson looking for help and advice. Honestly, I wasn't going to bring this up to talk about today because I am so close to the situation, but longtime Views of the News host Rod Gillette sent it to me yesterday, not realizing that we know Ryan, and I thought we really should talk about it at that point. I want to ask you, what are your reactions to some of the things he's said, he's seen, and he's decided on how to act from there?
Well, I just want to commend him for actually doing this. I mean, these are things that happen at incidents like this all the time. But very seldom the public doesn't know that this is going on. Mm-hmm. And so I want to commend him for that. I also want to, just take an opportunity to talk about how journalists need to think about their own actions in incidents like this. I mean, you're there to provide news and information to the public in a way that provides context and authenticity to the story. And oftentimes what I've seen in a lot of journalism these days is journalists becoming part of the story. And them becoming a part of the story sort of takes it away from what I think should be the authentic frame from which the information you're providing. And to me, it's just shoddy journalism and a lack of understanding and a lack of supervision on the part of some editors and some producers in reining this in. And it just becomes a circus. And we keep talking about this over and over again, where you see all these live trucks and all these cameras set up and networks going live with their morning shows and this sort of thing. And it becomes entertainment. And this isn't entertainment. These people are living their daily lives in this. And they are trying to create a voice that I think the rest of that neighborhood and the rest of that city needs to hear.
If you look at the comments below Ryan's blog, you'll see that it's overwhelmingly positive, with people basically saying, thank you for sharing this with us. We wish you were still here and covering the story. And on that latter comment, I'll have to say, reading the stories that he contributed to Al Jazeera, very good reporting. Especially, I like the piece about Kinloch. Now, that came from an original, I think, documentary or longer piece that Al Jazeera had done previously, but he built on it.
That Ryan had worked on.
But the story, basically looking at the people in the community, the residents who were trying to protect the stores and clean up the stores after looting, you didn't hear that from a lot of places, a few, but that was a really great story. So I do wish he were still able and willing to be there to cover more of the stories that he has already produced. People who said, there were some critics who suggested, well, he was making the story all about him. I don't think so. I do think he was genuinely shocked. And if you look at senior journalists who've been around for a while, I think we're kind of inured to some of how the sausage is made, and we think we can divorce that from what we put out on the air or in publication. And he didn't. And having a fresh perspective on some of the things that journalists do that people do notice is a good thing. Yeah,
I think also part of it is that, he was willing to basically air journalism's dirty laundry, so to speak. And that was where a lot of the criticism came. But I think that they really need to start policing themselves in instances like this.
There was one question that was raised by a few folks, including Jay Rosen at NYU, a media ethicist, basically.
About that he should have named names. So do you think it would have been more effective had he?
I don't know if it would have been more effective or not. I think it would have caused people to focus on the individual personalities and drive whatever agendas that was going to do. I thought the story wasn't about individuals. It was about, the behavior of journalists in general at the scene. And so I personally would not have named the names. I can see why, from a perspective of trying to authenticate what he was saying, it might have been useful, but I don't think it would help that much.
Okay, so while we're talking about comments, I want to bring up a story that's been brewing down in Jonesboro, Arkansas. The Jonesboro Sun police reporter, Sunshine Crump, and police chief Mike Yates had long had a tense relationship. It's because she had written a story about him teaching a class at Arkansas State University for extra pay without permission from any of his supervisors. The chief had to quit the job because of Crump's article. And apparently he never quite got over it, and he let the world know about it on Facebook, posting derogatory comments about her. Some examples. Wonder if old Sunshine could pass a drug test. Why, yes, she's been arrested before. And pro-dope smoking, law license revoked, left-wing liberal, Smelly, arrested by police, unscrupulous reporter. And then this one. Dealing with old Sunshine is like trying to pick up a dog turd by the clean end. Sunshine Crump quit her job and said that she felt unsafe. The city has since fired Mike Yates. Comments are really a scourge on journalism.
This is run amok. I've been reading this and actually looking at the which I think is on our links blog, the story from the TV station down there. It's incredible that the police chief actually thought that he could put this out there in social media and get away with it. And it's just mind-boggling.
It's one of those unintended consequences of social media that for once I'm kind of glad happened. I think the chief had no idea. Everybody goes on social media and says whatever they want to say without any regard for, the context or how it's going to affect people. But it showed his real colors, right? Okay. It showed his true colors. It showed him doing his own private investigation of this reporter and then exaggerating her record just to get back at her.
Here's the thing. You see this in comments all the time on a lot of stories. And I think it is a growing problem that media organizations are going to need to really take a look at in allowing people to make comments on stories that turn into vindictive sort of comments against either another commenter or a reporter or the media at large. It's something that really needs to be looked at.
Okay, well, later in September, we're going to do that. We're going to spend half hour talking about comments and where we can go with that. Turner Broadcasting, the cable side of Time Warner, presented buyout packages to somewhere between 500 and 600 employees. The cost-cutting measure is going to impact 4% or so of the workforce. And while things are getting better, we know times are still tough in the media industry, struggling with higher revenue models, cost of doing business, and so on. When announcing the cuts, though, CEO Jeff Zucker said he realized it was going to be painful. But it was the next thing he said that was kind of refreshing. He said, quote, "We are going to do less with less and have less to do it with." That's makes it a little bit easier to take, doesn't it? The idea that we don't have to keep working at the same levels.
I don't know. I mean, he's reflecting the reality. What we don't know is how many of those cuts are coming from the news side of CNN yet. It's all across the Turner properties. Probably there will be some. And he's right. I mean, you can see how it's reflected in his strategy of doing less of the same that everybody else does and more of these specialty programs, you know, whether it's with Anthony Bourdain or one of their own people. He sees that they're going to have to do less with less.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we don't have a lot of time here, but I don't want to miss out on this one. I want to talk about Michael Sam. Football player, right? Well, let me break some news for you. After practice and after games, he takes showers, and ESPN is on it. Take a listen, see what I mean.
There's been some interest as to whether or not Michael Sam has played well enough to make that top 75 and then eventually the final 53. How is he fitting in with his Rams teammates so far?
Well, Jay, defensive tackle Kendall Langford said that Michael Sam is simply just one of the guys, and he seems to be taking a rookie approach in terms of just listening and learning at his own pace. He said that you can tell he's just trying to feel his way through and perhaps see what guys he can relate to. But another Rams defensive player told me that, quote, Sam is respecting our space and that from his perspective, he seems to think that Michael Sam is waiting to kind of take a shower as not to make his teammates feel uncomfortable, while Langford and linebacker Alec Ogletree told me that they didn't know that specifically and also weren't tracking that. Now, while Langford told me, listen, I have not been in the shower at the same time as Michael Sam, he said that there definitely could be a million reasons as to why that is. He said he could be doing extra work on the practice field. He could be riding his bike. He could be doing extra cardio. But overall, Langford said he seems to be adjusting to the life in the NFL and the speed of the game.
Okay, I'm not even going to say anything. I'm just going to let your head shaking do it for us, huh?
Why? Why? I mean, it's almost like she should have just said, "I'm not going to do that." I don't get it.
All most of us care about is how he plays tomorrow night and whether he makes the roster on Saturday.
Yeah, it's just mind-boggling. I don't get it. I don't get it.
Wow.
But ESPN has now apologized.
ESPN has apologized, and hopefully we won't see anything like that again. I'd like to thank all of you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. It's under the Talk Shows tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments or questions or see what we'll be talking about next week. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, to Pat Akers for handling the audio. Hope Kerwin and Josie Herrera are our associate producers. I'm Amy Simons. And you should be sure to join us again next week when we're back with another edition of Views of the News.